The exclusion order is still in my desk drawer. Not the copy, the original, with my signature on the bottom line. Kept it the way a man keeps a thing he can't quite bring himself to throw away and can't quite explain why he hasn't. 8 years on, I still know what it cost to sign it, and I still know I signed it anyway. Colonel Marsh ran the briefing at FOB Crestwick on a Tuesday morning in November. Cold enough that the tent canvas had frost on the inside, 12 of us at the planning table. The Ardell Colol operation was 48 hours out. A 3-man recon element going up to the Ridgeline to establish a forward observation post, standard rotation, nobody expected contact. She was there when we came in. Badge on a lanyard, civilian contractor designation, a kit that looked lived in, and a face that didn't ask permission to be in the room. She'd been attached to the FOB for 6 days. I knew her name, Carver, and I knew her contract designation, and beyond that I hadn't looked closely enough to know anything else. Marsh looked at her for about 2 seconds. Then he looked at me. "Captain," he said, "this brief is operational." Contractor personnel wait outside. She didn't argue. That was the thing I remember most cleanly. She didn't do anything that would have given Marsh a reason to escalate. She picked up her coffee, nodded once at no one in particular, and walked out. The tent flap closed behind her, and Marsh moved straight to the map without breaking stride, like she'd been a logistical detail he'd resolved. I signed the exclusion order that afternoon. Marsh handed it across the table. I read the subject line, I signed it. I told myself it was above my pay grade to push back on a colonel's call about operational security in his own AOR. I was right about one thing, it was his call. I wasn't right about the rest of it. The recon element went up Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, Sergeant First Class Odell had gone down with high-altitude pulmonary edema at the forward staging cache. Couldn't move under. His own power, oxygen saturating at 72%. Staff Sergeant Bunn had a compound femur fracture from a rockfall on the approach to the coal. The third man, Corporal Hark, was ambulatory and keeping both of them alive, but the weather was coming in from the northwest, and the temperature was dropping. Marsh sent the extraction team up at 0200 Friday. I was at the radio table when they called back at 0347. Ice on the traverse. Wind loading the call at 40 plus. The team lead, a solid staff sergeant named Vickers, said the route was unworkable and he wasn't going to put his men on it in the dark at those temps. He wasn't wrong. Marsh told him to hold at cache below the coal and wait for first light. We all sat there and did the math on Odell's oxygen saturation and the temperature line, and didn't say it out loud. At Eero 411, the radio crackled. Not Vickers. Crestwick took, this is Ridgeline. I am at the Ardell Coal Traverse with 2 personnel in tow. Quest LZ designation at the Eastern Talus Field for Eero 530. Copy? 3 seconds of silence in the TAC. Marsh picked up the handset. Ridgeline, identify your authorization. No authorization, sir. Request LZ designation. He didn't answer for a long moment. Then he put the handset down and told the comms sergeant to get her the LZ designation. He said it quietly, and nobody in the room said anything, and the comms sergeant gave her the grid. She brought them down in 4 hours and 19 minutes. Odell on a litter she'd rigged from her own kit and a section of static line she'd pulled from the cache. She'd known the cache layout, which meant she'd read the route plan from somewhere, which meant she'd been doing her own planning. Since the morning Marsh walked her out of the tent. Bunn ambulatory on a field splint she'd set at the coal in the dark. Hark carrying one end of the litter and following her calls over the terrain without a light, because could she do the light would at a position on the traverse if anyone was watching from the high ground. She walked into the FOB at 0529, 1 minute before her own LZ window. Odell was already on his way to the aid station. She handed the litter frame to the medic, gave a 2-sentence handoff, saturations, the splint, the last glucose reading, and then she stood by the gate and drank from a water bottle and didn't say anything else. Marsh pulled her file an hour later. I was still in the TOC when the screen came up. 17 confirmed personnel recoveries across 3 theaters. Branch record for solo high-altitude extraction. 2 separate incidents at altitude above 4,200 meters. Classified citation from a commanding general that used the words, "the highest order of personal courage." A call sign assigned not by a unit but by the personnel she'd recovered, because that's who gave it to her. The men she'd brought off mountains and out of compounds, and through contested corridors in the dark. Ridgeline, because she always knew where the high ground was, and she always found a way down. Marsh read it in silence. The room read it with him. I watched his face go through something I don't have a clean word for. Not embarrassment, not guilt exactly. More like the specific recognition that the frame he'd used to see something had been too small for what he was looking at, and there was no way to unsee that now. He stood up. He walked the length of the table, past every man in that room, and he went outside to where she was still standing by the gate. I followed, because I had to see it. He stopped 2 feet from her. He came to attention. He rendered a formal salute and held it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she returned it. Clean and correct, her hand. "Sir," she said, "I read your file." Marsh said, "Yes, sir." He nodded once, like a man confirming something he'd already understood too late to do anything useful about. Then he went back inside. I didn't follow him right away. I stood there at the gate for a while in the cold, watching the eastern sky go from black to the particular gray that comes just before color returns to things. Odell was going to be fine. Bun was going to need surgery, but he was going to keep the leg. Hark had already eaten and was asleep in his bunk. I'd signed the exclusion order, because I hadn't looked closely enough. Because a badge on a lanyard had been all I'd seen, and I hadn't asked what was underneath it, and it hadn't occurred to me that I should. That was the whole of it. Not malice, not policy, just the laziness of a man who looked at the surface of a thing and decided he already knew the shape of it. She was gone by noon. Reassignment, new tasking, the machinery of it moved fast. I don't know where they sent her next. I hope whoever ran that brief read the file first. The exclusion order is still in my desk drawer. My name at the bottom, the date in the top right corner, the subject line reading operational security. Contractor exclusion in plain block letters. I don't keep it as a lesson. Keep it. Because I think a man ought to know the weight of what he signed. And I think the weight only stays honest if you can still put your hand on the paper. Ridgeline. Because she always knew where the high ground was.